Hi, welcome to week 6 of ITC314. In this topic, we're going to start to look at server virtualization and its optimization. So this is another quite interesting topic as we look at what's involved in creating those virtual servers. Now, in an enterprise, virtualization of servers is the area where we'll be doing most of our work. You will always have a use for a desktop virtual machine, granted, but the vast majority of work in enterprise consists of either converting physical servers to VMs or perhaps creating new VMs from scratch. So a bit of reading first. I'd suggest have a look through Topic 6 in Interact on server virtualization optimization. And then there's 2 chapters that you need to look at in the Portnoy book. Chapter 4, creating a virtual machine, there's 3 and a bit pages on P2V, physical to virtual migration. You need to read those. And then chapter 11, copying the virtual machine, covers a lot of the other stuff that we will look at today. So the first part of this topic deals with the creation of a new VM. So part of that process is deciding just what are we going to use that server for. So normally what we do is we dedicate it to a particular task, such as a mail server, a web server, a database server, so forth, right? Because if you restrict it to a particular task, then it allows that server to be much better configured for that particular task. And once you've done that, you can then start disabling all the other services, the operating system services, that you don't actually need. So this means the server then has more resources available for use by the VM, right? And it also reduces the attack profile of that server, which makes it harder for somebody attacking it to gain a foothold. Now, this is further tightened up later when we go through that process of server hardening, and we'll talk about that later on. But this idea of adjusting and tuning virtual servers is something that we need to do on a regular basis. And it's, again, a part of the regular process in enterprise, monitoring, reviewing, looking at things, adjusting. And so if you're looking at the VMs, you'll be looking probably particularly at RAM, at the virtual machine add-ons or tools that are available to give you some indications about what's happening in there and how it's using resources, efficiently or otherwise. But you'll also be looking at the virtual disks, the virtual machine page files, and the swap space. And so you might be able to monitor those and see how they're performing in order for you to get better performance out of that particular VM. But it's not just the VM you need to monitor. You also need to monitor the host machines. And again, we do similar things here. We look at the CPU usage on the hosts. We look at the RAM usage. We look at disks. We look at disk configuration and their controllers, because that's going to affect how things work for the VMs. Do they need defragmentation and optimization? This is a vexed question that a lot of people have different arguments about, but we'll leave that to a later date. Virus scanning. Should you do it? When do you do it? Do you do it all the time? Again, somewhat of a vexed question sometimes. And also host dedication, because this is kind of interesting. A lot of people, think, oh, I've got a host sitting there doing not much else. I'll use it as a file server as well, or a print server. And in fact, what the resources left on the host are there for is to run the host and the hypervisor. So you really need to dedicate the host to being a host. And not use it for all sorts of other things. You can always run up another VM. We also need to look at network optimization. Of course, optimizing that network is quite important for VMs, as this can provide a communications bottleneck. But there's some very simple approaches that work well. Don't share a NIC which is dedicated to the host with VMs. The host also needs communications. And if you've got it in a cluster with other hosts, then it needs to communicate with them. If you've got a VM which is highly traffic dependent, such as a web server, or perhaps a database server which gets a lot of access, then you may need to think about dedicating, a physical NIC to that VM where it's possible. So this means we need to start thinking about how do we connect our host machines to the network in order to get optimum communications. So, we might start to think, do we move to a gigabit network? Is the backbone sufficiently fast enough to have enough bandwidth in the backbone to be able to do what we want to do? Do we need to move to fiber optic communications with the host? and so forth. So we start to think about how is this going to affect the infrastructure, because it's an ongoing process that we'll look at the way through. And again, this is something that you'll consider in your work in the enterprise. And of course, where it always heads is towards backup and DR. And there's three basic strategies for backup of VMs that we'll look at during this topic. We can back up the virtual disk files using a file copy. There's usually, we can have some backup software running, and quite often the VM vendors provide different sets of backup software to back up VMs. Or we can have backup software running on the VM itself. Right, so, but backup is always just the first step, and it's the first step to disaster recovery. And any DR plan should also consider, if we've got some backups, can we restore them? Have we ever tested a restore? And so it's great having backups there, but if you've never ever tested a restore to make sure it works, then you never know if it's going to work. Where do we have the backups stored? Can we access them if something goes wrong? If things do go completely pear-shaped and we have a disaster, can we actually access those backup files? Can we restore those backups in a new location on different sets of hardware in case of a disaster? So again, there are lots of questions when you think about this. Some of the things we'll start to discuss in this week's topic. Of course, some of these things will carry on into other topics as well later, but the discussions will start here. But we also look at VM and server migration here, and we'll look at two different migration problems. The first one is the physical server to a virtual server, also known by its acronym P2V. Right? And we'll look at three different approaches we can do here: the cold clone, the hot clone, and the manual clone. Right? So they will be three ways that we can approach that. The other problem we always have is that from time to time you have to migrate the VMs to a new host server. So there's a couple of different approaches here: file copy migration, excuse me, or virtualization software migration. And so we'll go over those two topics, those two approaches in this topic to show you the different approaches that can be used. So where's this going to fit as part of your studies? Well, again, this topic ties into last week's topic. It helps you to meet these learning outcomes of communicate the essentials of network storage virtualization and discuss and evaluate requirements for effective virtual machine management. And again, this will help you do assignments 3 and 4, as we discussed last week, but also the final exam. And as I said before, and I'll reiterate the point again, this is the sort of knowledge that you'll constantly use in your workplace to manage that VM fleet that you've got in place. And so this is something you need to be quite aware of. These are pretty important topics. So if you have any questions, again, please start raising them on your discussion board, raise it with your lecturer, and we'll see if we can get those questions resolved. See you all next week.